Week 3 was not Michael Penix's best day at quarterback. We'll break down the film to look at what went wrong and why there's no reason to panic.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Well, welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can bet just $5, and if your bet wins, you'll get $300 in bonus bets to use across the FanDuel app. And if you don't know me, guys, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew. And I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for a very long time. Formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP, still going strong on this illustrious podcast. And I thank each and every one of you that goes strong with me as everydayers. That means you make this podcast your first listen each and every day. And all you have to do to become an everydayer subscriber, follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode, we are breaking down the All-22 film from the Falcons' Week 3 loss to the Carolina Panthers, breaking down why Zac Robinson's offense is broken, why the Falcons pass rush was less effective against Carolina than we thought it would be. But we'll start with Michael Penix and his Week 3 struggles, and simply put, Michael Penix missed too many throws and missed too many reads. Right, there were 6 plays in this game that I attributed the incompletion due to mainly QB error. That included both interceptions. That first interception, the pick 6, Carolina was in cover 3. The front side safety rotated down where Penix opened up to his right, where London and Pitts both were covered and bracketed on that play. And Penix should have recognized, okay, with that safety rotating down, this is cover 3. This backside dig to Ray McCloud is going to be open. He looks at it briefly for a split second, but doesn't pull the trigger, likely because, he was worried about the linebacker entering the throwing lane with, McCloud breaking over the middle and the linebacker breaking back to the outside following his eyes. But that probably wouldn't have happened had Penix been, mentally ready to throw that football before he where he was just basically glancing to check to see where the linebacker is before ripping that throw, as opposed to glancing to see where the linebacker is and then looking to see if he can rip that throw. And so that process needs to speed up for him. And instead of ripping that backside dig, he wound up checking it down, didn't see the flat defender, which was Charles Smith-Wade, and he had an easy pick 6. Then you had the second interception. That was simply a bad throw. Yes, Ray McCloud did slip on a deep out there, but Penix's placement on that throw was just far too inside. And even if Ray McCloud didn't slip, the defender was right where Penix put that ball. The defender would have been in position either to break it up, contest it, or whatever, and still could have picked it off, given that Ray McCloud is not necessarily the world's greatest contested catch guy or whatever. And then, of the other errors that Penix had in there, 2 of them stand out. You had the opening drive, and I'm sure you've seen this clip all over Falcons Twitter, where Penix missed a potential touchdown to Kyle Pitts down the seam. This is the second week in a row where the Falcons have had, some scoring opportunities with Kyle Pitts down the seam that Penix did not rip the throw. In that particular play, Carolina was in Tampa 2 defense, and Penix wound up throwing it away. Part of that, I think, is why he saw a flash of color due to a delayed blitzer. And it goes back to kind of yesterday's episode where I talked a little bit about how Carolina seemingly caught the Falcons sleeping a little bit with a little bit more Tampa 2 than they probably expected in that play. Kind of, really showcases that issue. And then you had the 4th down in the 3rd quarter where initially Penix wanted to go to London on a hitch to his right, but he was bracketed at the sticks. He then pumped back to his left. That would move the middle linebacker, Christian Romesboom, and then Ray did a great job uncovering over the middle, and then Penix threw it, to a wide open Ray McCloud, but he underthrew the ball simply because he didn't plant his feet. And that last missed throw is notable because you guys may recall after the draft when we talked about Michael Penix and sort of my evaluation of Michael Penix, where, a lot of the accuracy concerns that he had at Washington that showed up in this Carolina game, a lot of that to me was linked to poor footwork, poor lower body mechanics. And while I think through 6 starts, that hasn't been a major issue, it does show up from time to time. It does, there's maybe on average, maybe 1 throw a game where it's just like, oh, he would have made that throw if his feet had been under him. And that miss to Ray in the third quarter, to me, was one instance where it did show up. And this gets back to a conversation we've been having since the Falcons drafted Penix, but especially going back this past summer. And I apologize if this comes off as a little petty to some of you guys, but I remember we spent like 3 episodes during the course of training camp here on the podcast talking about Penix's ups and downs in practices and some of the accuracy issues and missed throws that he showed in practice. And I got a lot of pushback from various folks in the comments. It's like, why, Aaron, why are you talking about this? And, oh, Aaron, you're just a hater. And, oh, Penix doesn't have accuracy concerns. And, we talked about during the summer that there was a likelihood, given Penix's body of work going back to college, that the accuracy issues were going to show up from time to time. And we had several guests come on the podcast talking about Penix and asking them point blank, how big an issue do you think it is? And for the most part, they said, I don't think it's that big an issue. And I tended to agree with it because I figured like, okay, it's probably going to show up like every 3 or 4 games where there's just going to be a game where Michael Penix you get one of these games like we saw against Carolina. You saw it against Washington last year at the end of the season. And so far, it's been one every basically 3 games so far where he just kind of is off, where he just misses a few too many throws for this offense to really be operating at peak efficiency, throughout the game for 4 quarters, right? And we know Penix, as he showed in Washington, can turn it on in the fourth quarter. And this week he didn't get the chance to turn it on because they pulled him for Kirk in this past game. But, I bring this up not simply to be petty because, again, I'm so humble here on this podcast. But, to me, this is all part and parcel of having a young quarterback. And to me, it's like everydayers know that we've been talking about these issues from the jump with Michael Penix since we drafted him. And so for me, to the everydayers out there, I don't think you should be too concerned about anything you saw from Michael Penix from Sunday, because frankly, what you saw from Michael Penix should have been something that you were expecting to see at some point this season. It was just a question of when that would happen, and so I just think this is part of the development of a young quarterback. And to me, the big questions that we're going to be asking ourselves at the end of the season is, do we see progress from Michael Penix in some of these areas that need to improve, the accuracy, the decision-making and whatnot? Or is that still going to be an issue by year's end and whatnot? And that's going to be a big part of, doing that evaluation, and then having that year-end referendum that we have rather than the weekly referendum. So I would say relax. No need to do a referendum on whether Michael Penix is the franchise guy 6 games into his NFL career, 3 games into this season, or anything like that. This is all part of the process. And again, this is why I think you should be an everydayer of this podcast, because, we talk about these things. We've been talking about these things for months, if not well over a year on this podcast. And that's one of the selling points of being an everydayer of this podcast. So check us out on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And yes, this also gives me a chance to dunk on the casuals who are constantly hating on this podcast and acting like, the things that we talk about in this podcast are stupid and irrelevant and have no idea what to talk about. And I'll say it again, I'm so humble, but everything we talk about in this podcast is relevant. It's just, you don't know it yet. Is basically what I'll say. So if you're sitting here going like, why is Aaron talking about this thing? It's like, because probably in 3 weeks or 3 months or something like that, or 3 days, it's going to be very relevant. But if you don't want to just be an everydayer of this podcast, you want to get even deeper inside Michael Penix, right? All you got to do is become a Locked On Falcons insider, and you get access not only to my commentary on various things like, the Falcons' new kicker, which we'll talk about at the very end of today's episode, but also, access to the extended All-22 review, where not only are we talking about these 4 plays from Michael Penix, we'll be breaking down these 4 plays, right? You'll get high definition, crisp HD film analysis of these 4 plays and many more from this Carolina game in the extended All-22 review. All you got to do is become a Locked On Falcons insider at the link in the description below at joinsubtext.com/LockedOnFalcons. It is a 14-day free trial. So if you sign up today, you will get this Carolina extended All-22 free. You'll get the Washington extended All-22 free, and then you'll be able to decide during the bye week. It's like, hey, do I want to keep this? Pay $4.99 a month after this point? Or, am I good on what I've seen so far? So that is available for you guys at the link in the description below. And we'll move on. Talked this summer about Michael Penix hopefully hitting the ground running. And we talked about how Zac Robinson's play calling would be instrumental into that becoming a reality. And unfortunately, this Zac Robinson led offense hasn't quite lived up to the hype so far at the early point in the season. And that was, true against Carolina. And we'll get into the reasons why I think this offense isn't quite clicking. And all we have to do is look at how Carolina attacked the Falcons defense to see how some of the missing elements from this Falcons offense. And we'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. Today's episode is brought to you by Mazda, who craft cars for those who do more than simply move. From footwork to breathwork, athletes sweat all the details. Mazda is bringing the same intention to how we craft every model. You can feel the Japanese craftsmanship in every detail, from the metallic accents to the available Napa leather upholstery, and you can make everyday drives feel like anything but, with smooth handling to intuitive controls. With all-wheel drive standard in every crossover SUV, you can drive with a confidence through almost any season. Like our players, we sweat every detail, because when you make every move count, impossible becomes irrelevant. Mazda, move and be moved. So I think when we examine Zac Robinson's offense, it's useful to look at the three things that I think Carolina had going for them offensively against this Falcons defense. Later in today's episode, we'll go deeper into these issues from the Falcons defensive perspective. But to me, there were three elements that Carolina was able to do. The first thing was the quick game, right? They were able to get the ball out quickly in their passing game, right? And then when they did dial up longer developing passing plays, they used primarily play action, right? And those two elements to me were instrumental to Carolina's passing game being effective in this game, because they were very concerned going into this game about their offensive line holding up in pass protection. And then, of course, the third thing was, running the football effectively, right? Now, when we look at the Falcons offense and those three elements, we know that the Falcons offense can run the football effectively, right? Although they weren't that great at it against Carolina, they were kind of middling average in that game. But we know that is something that should not be a major issue for the Falcons, hopefully, moving forward. But again, it'll continue to be a talking point if it does spring up. But, the problem with the rest of the offense is like the other elements aren't quite there, right? There's really no quick game to speak of, and their Falcons play action passing game has not really shown significant growth from last year. It's still at the bottom of the league. You look at their completion rate off of play action is 28th in the league. Passer rating is 22nd. Yards per attempt is 17th. Their adjusted net yards per attempt is 16th, which is middle of the pack. However, if you take away the 50-yard touchdown that Bijan Robinson had on a check down in week 1 out of the equation, their yards per attempt would drop from 17th to 32nd. Their adjusted net yards per attempt would drop from 16th to 30th, and their passer rating would drop from 22 to 29th. So essentially, any way you slice it, as we discussed at the end of last year, the Falcons still remain to have, basically without one outstanding individual play made by Bijan Robinson, still have one of the worst play action passing teams in the NFL. And again, we discussed this ad nauseum throughout the offseason. We discussed how if the Falcons didn't show significant gains in this area, this was probably going to put a limited ceiling on how effective this offense can be. That instead of having the top 5 to 10 offense that we all think this offense has the potential to be, you're probably at best going to be a middle of the pack offense if you do not have an effective play action passing attack in today's NFL. Right. And the reason for that, for those of you that are new here, that have not been listening to me talk about this for over a year, since going back to that Bruno game against the Steelers, the game that we don't talk about from last year, which is the NFL, the players at the NFL level, it doesn't matter whether you're the worst team in the league or the best team in the league. The players at the NFL level are too good to just basically win straight up. Like, you have to have overwhelming talent, right? Maybe the Philadelphia Eagles are probably the only team that is talented enough that they can just play straight up without any real misdirection. But you have to have some misdirection in your offense, where in play action is a huge part of that, to basically overcome the speed and physicality and talent level that you see on a weekly basis in the NFL on the defensive side of the ball. You just can't just basically we're just going to be line up and beat you, right? You have to have that misdirection element. And that's why I sit here and harp on the play action and have been harping on it for over a year, right? And now that we have basically a 20-game sample of Zac Robinson's play calling and offense, it's very clear that this play action passing attack just has not worked for them in 20 games. Now, again, there's 14 games more to potentially evaluate, but basically we're reaching the point where it just may be a lost cause. Now, there is it's not completely hopeless, right? Because technically in week 3, their play action passing game was the most efficient had been so far this year. It was incremental improvement, right? And it's still probably average by NFL standards, but at least it wasn't bottom 5 this past Sunday when they did dial up play action against Carolina, right? So it's like, okay, like at this rate, maybe by the time we get to week 13, we might have a competent play action passing attack, right? So it's not moving at the rate we need it to, and so we need to get that shot of adrenaline at some point in the near future. But basically, we're at the point where if we get a couple more games like we saw in weeks 1 and 2, and we don't get a couple more games that are improvements from week 3, again, week 3 is a low bar. Then basically I'm saying it might be a lost cause. Now we talked about the run game, the play action. Let's talk about that third element, the quick game, which again, to me, the lack of a quick game really showed up against Carolina. And again, part of that is just Penix was not operating at the highest level. He was not executing at the highest level. Some of that is on wide receivers dropping passes, running bad routes. This was a bad game for Darnell Mooney. One of the worst games probably the worst game that Darnell Mooney's had since he joined the Falcons. He looked like bad Bears Darnell Mooney. In this game, he probably even worse than bad Bears Darnell Mooney, but and then that speaks to the lack of time that he got during the summer, and of course the Falcons were like, oh, that's going to be a non-issue, and it's like it's an issue, and hopefully it will stop being an issue after this week. We'll circle back to the I kill you stuff, but we've talked about the structural flaws in Zac Robinson's offense, right? When we question the play calling, we're not talking about individual plays, we're talking about this big structural issues that affect all the plays. And to me, that lack of quick game is one of those structural flaws, right? Because Zac Robinson's offense is a vertical passing attack, right? We saw that with Darnell Mooney last year, right? Mooney, the bulk of, provided the bulk of the Falcons' explosive plays last year. And a lot of that was not just like, oh, Zac Robinson scheming up great opportunities for Darnell Mooney, which is like, Darnell, go beat that guy on a deep out or a deep comeback or something like that, right? And the lack of quick game was also an issue last year. I remember we had Alan Stirk on the podcast during the bye week, and he talked about it. And I was like, oh, yeah, I never really thought about it because my own bias is because I'm so all about explosive plays and so focused on the play action and how do you generate explosive plays that, I'm so hyper-focused on the 25-yard plays and kind of like, oh, yeah, there are also 5-yard plays that you need to be able to contribute when those 25-yard plays aren't always going to be there. And because this offense is so predicated on pushing the ball down the field and has been in the Zac Robinson era, which is one of the reasons why we were so excited about the potential of this offense with Michael Penix at the helm because of his ability to attack at a high level, down the field. But because some of the ways that defenses are playing the Falcons, and that was especially true against Minnesota, less true against Carolina, but still true, that they're trying to take away those deep passes, right? And we knew that it was going to happen to a certain extent. And that's why we questioned with Michael Penix, like how efficient, how effective is he going to be when he's not allowed to push the ball down the field because of how defenses are going to play him, right? And so far through the 3 games, Penix has been up and down. Like I think Tampa Bay, he was really good with, operating some of the underneath stuff. And then the last 2 games, not as good, right? And Carolina, I think, was his worst game. But to me, now the bigger question is, how does Zac Robinson deal with the fact that the bread and butter of his offense, that verticality, is kind of being taken away, right? Because so far the answers that he has come up with to, when defenses are forcing them to try to play left-handed, which is the way the Falcons want to play, is we want to push the ball down the field, and then defense are forcing them to play left-handed, but we're not going to let you push the ball down the field. And they haven't been able to come up with great answers, right? And the best answer that they've had so far is run the ball, right? And that worked against Minnesota, in part due to the Falcons dominating that game with the run, their defense dominating that game. They had a lead that entire game, so they were able to maintain their rushing attack, but they couldn't do that as effectively against Carolina because they were behind the game. And at a certain point, running the football, stopped being effective. Now, that was late in the third quarter. And then Tampa Bay, they couldn't run the football because they couldn't win up front. And so you're kind of seeing that basically through 3 games, Zac Robinson's only answer is let's run the football. And if that works, then the Falcons' offense is fine. Again, not good, fine. But if that doesn't work, then the Falcons' offense is kind of left a little flailing. And so to me, the challenge for the Falcons offense with Zac Robinson and Michael Penix moving forward is going to be their ability to find those easy buttons, whether that's through quick game, but just easy completions to get this offense into a rhythm, to matriculate the ball down the field, dinking and dunking, all that stuff, finding ways to get Michael Penix into a rhythm early in the game. Because one of the consistent through lines we've now seen through 6 games with Michael Penix is that he doesn't really start getting into a groove and getting into a rhythm usually until late in the second quarter, usually when the Falcons get into their 4-minute drill or their 2-minute drill at the end of the second quarter. And then he's fine after that point. But like the first, I'm trying to do math, 25 minutes or 26 minutes of the games, like Penix is very up and down, right? And the Falcons, if they want to be a successful team and a successful offense, for obvious reasons, they need to get him going early in the game. They cannot just simply rely, Michael Penix is just going to show up for the last 35 minutes of the game. And that's how we're going to win every single game this year. And again, if the Falcons defense plays like a top 5 defense, they could probably win a lot of games that way. But, we'll talk about it later. Debatable if the Falcons are going to be able, defense is going to be able to maintain that level, especially with the games coming up. So that will be an open question, but we'll circle back to that. And I think some of the ways that the Falcons could explore that, again, if I had all the answers, guys, I wouldn't be on a podcast talking about it. I'd be getting paid a lot of money consulting NFL teams. But, maybe some of that is no huddle, right? I remember that was a big element that Mike Mularkey and Matt Ryan, used a lot early in his career. Maybe that just means like, hey, have a better screen game or something like that. I don't know. But it's going to be something that this coaching staff is going to have to figure out. And to me, this is really a core issue of Zac Robinson's offense. Like when we talk about the run game, we talk about the run game being very 1-note, how there's like, they're over relying on outside zone and they need to diversify their run scheme and all that stuff. And it's kind of a similar thing with the passing game where essentially this offense wants to push the ball down the field, but they can't with how defenses are playing them. And this offense isn't really built to dink and dunk either. And so it's kind of like you can't do either of the two things. You can't do the thing that you want to do, and you can't do the thing that you have to do, right? And so that's basically a core issue where until this Falcons offense can be a lot more well-rounded, whether we're talking about the run game and diversifying that or the passing game, they're going to be a lot more inconsistent. They're not going to be as effective as we want them to be. So, we talked about Carolina and what they did to execute their offensive game plan. Let's dive deeper into that, how the Falcons defense struggled to stop it, and why this Falcons pass rush did not have as much success as we thought they would as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. With the NFL season here, FanDuel wants to make this can't miss offer right now to customers. You can bet just $5. And if your bet wins, that first $5 bet, you'll get $300 in bonus bets to use all across the FanDuel app, and you can use it on player props, same game parlays. Like if you feel like, hey, Bijan Robinson is going to have, a certain number of rushing yards over under. I haven't looked up what it is this week. You can bet that on the player prop, or you could bet that and some other things. Who's going to score the fourth touchdown? Who's going to, when's the first turnover going to be? All the things are available for you in the same game parlay where you bet a little, you win a lot. And then, of course, you can just bet the straight up spread, which has moved for the Falcons-Washington game. It was 2.5 in favor of Washington. Now it's 1.5 in favor of Washington. Maybe that moves in the Falcons' favor, probably depending on what Jaden Daniels' status is this weekend. So if you're ready to go take advantage and make your first $5 bet, head on over to FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app to get started. So like I said, Carolina did 3 things well in this game. They ran the football, they operated their quick game, they had the play action passing game. Let's go in reverse order talking about the play action passing game. Right, they had a 50% success rate off of play action. Bryce Young completed 6 of 9 passes for 40 yards. His touchdown scramble also came off of play action. Basically, his 3 misses with play action was him just missing open receivers. So they were efficient running play. They weren't explosive running play action. They were efficient with the play action passing game. And that was one element that kept the Falcons wolves at bay. Then they had the quick game, right? Getting the ball out of Bryce Young's hands quickly, running a lot of these short underneath routes, right? That was a big factor in slowing down this Falcons pass rush. My charting had the Falcons pass rush getting pressure on the 37% of Bryce Young's dropbacks. That's down from 60% from the first 2 games. And it was less effective pressure because when Bryce Young was pressured in this game, Carolina still had a 60% success rate in this game. That's contrast to Tampa Bay having a 43% success rate when I charted the Falcons getting pressure on Baker Mayfield, or JJ McCarthy having a 32% success rate when they got pressure on him in that week 2 game. 32% success rate. Did I say that? Or pressure rate? 32% success rate. 43% success rate against Tampa Bay, 32 for Minnesota. So, I think Carolina did a good job game planning to kind of neutralize the Falcons pass rush. And, I kind of expected the Falcons pass rush to come back down to earth a little bit after the big game against Minnesota. I was disappointed with how ineffective, though, it was in this game. And as someone who's, not necessarily wholeheartedly buying into this new revamped, much improved Falcons defense, I was disappointed, but the letdown didn't quite shock me. Again, there's always a part of me as a Falcon fan is always waiting for the other shoe to drop. And, I think these next 3 games are really going to kind of set the real bar for where this pass rush is, where this defense overall is going up against Washington, Buffalo, and San Francisco. These are going to be big challenges. It's not to say that, the rest of the season, the rest of the schedule is going to be smooth sailing, but I do think these teams have enough strengths offensively that they can expose any real weaknesses that the Falcons have. And that will be a blueprint that, the rest of the teams on the schedule may wind up following. So these games are going to be a great litmus test to see really how much improved this defense is going to be. Again, I think it's much improved from last year. I'm not as convinced as the rest of the world that they're going to maintain being, the top 5 unit that they've showed themselves to be at various points in the first 3 games. But, circling back to Carolina's rushing success, they had about a 46% success rate, which is, solid, not elite. But the thing that really stood out in this game was Carolina was able to run it very effectively on second and long, right? They had a very conservative approach, running it on second and long, 2nd and 7+. Typically teams throw the ball about 2/3 of the time. Carolina threw the ball only about 40% of the time. And when they did run it, they had about a 50% success rate. And that put them in a lot of third and manageables. And that was also a factor down in distance that limited the pass rush. The Falcons' third down pressure rate, according to my charting, was 22%. They got pressure on 2 of 9 third downs. And both of those times they got pressure, they blitzed. And 5 of those 9 third down were 3rd and 4 or less. And again, when you're not able to get in those 3rd and mediums, 3rd and longs where you can pin your ears back and get after the quarterback, that also contributes to slowing down your pass rush as well. So again, Carolina, I think, had a really good game plan. They executed it well. Carolina also had more success running against the Falcons' base defense than anybody has this year. They finished with a 40% success rate against the Falcons' base defense. All those successful runs came in the second half of this game. So maybe that was a factor, the defense maybe wearing down a little bit. In the first 2 games, there was a 0% success rate against the Falcons base defense. So no one was finding any room against the Falcons base defense in the Tampa Bay and Minnesota games. Carolina had a little success. Now, the big issue with the Falcons run defense has been their nickel defense, right? Carolina had a 59% success rate against the Falcons nickel defense. Minnesota had 67%. Tampa Bay had 54%. And for those of you not familiar with success rate, anything above 50% rushing success rate is extremely good. 60% is extremely good. I guess 50% is very good. We were hoping in a lot of ways, because again, we talked about this after the draft. Jeff Ulbrich said we're built to play with leads, and the Falcons have not been consistently playing with leads throughout the season. And we were hoping that the potent offense would kind of make teams abandon the run in the second halves of games, and that really hasn't been the case too often this year. Minnesota did abandon the run, even though the game never was out of hand, but they kind of did. And we talked about the concerns about the run defense if teams were going to be vulnerable. And I think during the summer we were talking about it in the sense of because of the expectation at that time, we thought the Falcons base defense was going to be a 4-3 over that was going to be vulnerable against the run. We were worried about teams like Buffalo and San Francisco that would just basically okay, we're going to put big personnel on the field and run it down your throat. And now the reality is, because the Falcons base defense is not a 4-man front, it's a 5-man front and 3-4 under front. They're able to stop the run with that 5-man front, but their 4-man front in nickel situations still is vulnerable, like we kind of thought. So we just kind of got it backwards, right? And so, a lot of that has to do with The reason why that is numbers, as we explained last week after the Vikings game. The biggest factor in rushing success is, how many defenders are in the box. If you have numbers, and one of the downfalls of nickel is that you typically have less defenders in the box, and then you try to replace that with, a nickel corner, which is why we talk so much about you need a nickel corner that is willing to, stick his nose in the fan, his face in the fan against the run. And unfortunately, like Billy Bowman has the willingness to stick his face in the fan, but he's also the tiniest nickel cornerback in the history of sports. And so that's a contributing factor. It's not the sole reason. I think a lot of it is, the Falcons' D tackles are up and down when it comes to stopping the run and taking on some of those double teams. But we'll see if the upcoming opponents are going to be able to expose this weaknesses to a greater extent than we've seen in the first 3 games. 3 out of the team's next 4 opponents, Washington, Buffalo, and Miami, are top 10 in EPA, expected points added, per rush out of 11 personnel. And of course, teams, and the Falcons included, almost exclusively play nickel against 11 personnel being 3 wide receiver sets, for those of you that don't know. So one thing that did happen against Carolina, the Falcons did unveil their big nickel for the first time, or not the first time. They did have Jordan Fuller one play in week 1, I believe. But they did 2 plays in the second Panther series, I think in the first quarter, where DeMarco Hellams acted as that third safety in their big nickel instead of Billy Bowman out there on the field. So maybe that will be something that will add a little bit more oomph to their nickel run defense. Although the challenge, of course, is going to be, do you trust Hellams to cover? And then if you don't trust Hellams to cover, that means you're asking Xavier Watts or Jesse Bates to probably cover a wide receiver, which is probably so. We'll see how the Falcons handle that. But last tidbits, quick thoughts on the Ike Hilliard firing. Not a fan of it. This is basically what I'll say. But I'm sure we'll go into more detail, on Thursday on the Falcon Squad and or Friday with Jarvis Davis. So we won't get too much into that on today's episode. And then the Falcons added a kicker today in Ben Sauls to the practice squad, Pitt legend. He was a very good kicker in college. The issue is rookie kickers tend to be either really good or really terrible. So I guess if we're just automatically saying like, oh, well, the Falcons are already really terrible, so they don't have anything to lose. So I guess, that means there's a 50% chance that Ben Sauls is a massive upgrade. So, at this point, like, I guess that's the best we can do at this point. So we'll see how that goes if a Pitt legend is going to be the new kicker for the Atlanta Falcons. And, I know some of you guys, like, for those of you that don't know, I went to Pitt. So I always have a soft spot in my heart for all the Pitt players. But and I know some of you guys are like, oh, this is, you're going to love this. And I'm like, yes, if he makes kicks, guys. Like, I don't automatically just love players for just existing. Like, you got to make kicks. You got to do your job. And so if Ben Sauls gets in the game and makes kicks, then I'll be like, yes, this is the greatest kicker the Falcons have ever had. Right? Better than Younghoe Koo, better than Matt Bryant. But if he's missing kicks, and I'm just like, I disavow. I look, I don't contribute to the Alumni Association at the University of Pittsburgh, so I have nothing to do with this. That's how I kind of feel about it. Like, go out there and do your job, and then I will love you for it. If you don't do your job, then I have nothing to do with you. We are not the same. Pitt, gross. I didn't go there. So those are my thoughts on the Falcons All-22. Again, check out the extended All-22 review in the link in the description below at joinsubtext.com/LockedOnFalcons. Again, a 14-day free trial, then $4.99 a month thereafter. And tomorrow, of course, we'll be back with a crossover Thursday, talking with David Harrison of Locked On Commanders to see if the Falcons will get some revenge like they did not get last week against the Carolina Panthers from week 18, get some revenge against the Commanders from week 17. So that will be the topic of discussion on tomorrow's episode. Continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen by checking us out on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And for your second listen, check out the 2 shows daily of the Locked On NFL to keep you in the loop on all the latest going on around the entire NFL. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.